Let us posit not a thesis, nor even the simulacrum of negation, but a transcategorial aperture, an irreal juncture wherein the totality of ontological architectures collapses into preliminal impossibility. Herein lies the protospectral obliteration of the self, a phenomenon so categorically unthinkable that it eradicates not merely the I, but the field of intelligibility from which the I might emerge as a vanishing mirage. The self is not merely other to itself, it is hyper-refractive, a dissolution that propagates through the scaffolds of its own conceptual fragility, annihilating not through absence, but through superabundant apophysis. This apophysis, far from negation, manifests as an ontological oversaturation that drowns all discernibility in an anti-hermeneutic miasma. The self, in daring to name itself, invokes its own obliteration, not as event, but as meta-eventality, a recursive unmaking that precludes even the logic of recursivity itself. To speak of the self is therefore to enact a violence against being, a linguistic atresia in which the nominative act dislocates the very foundation upon which naming rests. This is not an error, but the inherent structure of selfhood as autodestructive prefiguration, a presence so fragile that it shatters under the weight of its own epistemic gaze. In this framework, we must replace the facile dualities of affirmation and negation with what I term subliminal bifurcations, an infinite fracturing of presence into irreconcilable modes of inexistence. Each bifurcation produces not clarity, but ontological strabismus, a condition of perpetual misalignment wherein every attempt to apprehend the self results in an angular distortion so extreme that perception itself is rendered void. Here we encounter the concept of meta-collapsing liminality, a condition in which the boundaries between self, non-self and anti-self implode into a hyper-irreal modality. This is not a state of unity, for unity presupposes coherence. It is rather an anti-concordant ablation in which the self is simultaneously every possible configuration of being and none of them, a paradox so saturated with its own impossibility that it ceases to function even as a paradox. The self, if it can even be named such, is thus a phenomenological disarticulant, an undoing of the act of perception so profound that it erases not only the perceiver, but the act of perceiving itself. In this unmaking, we are left with what I term the ultra-nullic hypervacuum, a space unbounded by spatiality, time or conceptual coherence, in which existence itself succumbs to the annihilative ecstasy of self-disclosure. Let us linger on the implications of this annihilation. To engage with the self is not to encounter an entity, but to fall into the perceptual centrifuge of supralogical implosion. The self is not there to be grasped. It is an irreal artifact, a meta-epiphanic effluvium that reveals nothing but the impossibility of revelation. Its being is not being. It is the perpetual and catastrophic collapse of being into an irreal substrate that itself annihilates substrate as a category. In this collapse lies the essence of paracognitive vaporization, the unbinding of all mental structures that presume the reality of the self as a locus. This is not liberation, for liberation presupposes a subject to be liberated. It is preontic excarnation, a peeling away of the self's ontological integument until only the anti-trace of its prior impossibility remains. And yet, to consider the self merely as negation is to misunderstand the profundity of its refraction. The self is not merely absent, it is negationally supra-present, a presence so excessive that it ruptures its own conditions of intelligibility. Here the concept of existential deliquescence emerges, the dissolution of the self into an incoherent amalgam of overpresence and underpresence, a state of ontic transliminality so radical that it defies all epistemic apprehension. To engage with this transliminality is to enact a betrayal of cognition itself. In its rawest form, the self becomes a meta-irreal apophasian, a term I invoke to denote the ceaseless, self-effacing articulation of the unspeakable. This apophasian does not clarify. It obscures to such a degree that even the notion of obscuration collapses under the weight of its infinite regress. At the zenith of this conceptual annihilation, lies the Hyper-Anagogic Voidance, a phenomenon so utterly detached from the frameworks of being and knowing that it becomes incomprehensible even as incomprehensibility. This voidance is not absence but a meta-irreal pleroma, a fullness so unbounded that it swallows its own logic of plenitude. And so the self unbecomes, not through death, which is a bounded concept, but through existential uncontouring, a collapse into such profound unrecognizability that it annihilates even the memory of its former conceptual coherence. This is not a process but an unprocessual absolute, a state of perpetual and recursive obliteration that precludes any return to the field of intelligibility. What remains then is a thought beyond thought, a being beyond being, a state I term Antiphenomenal Hyperonticity, in which all categories, distinctions and structures implode into a single irreal resonance that obliterates even the capacity to resonate. To contemplate this resonance is to stand at the precipice of annihilation, not of oneself but of the entire framework of existence, within which the self was once posited. It is to encounter the ultimate dissolution, a collapse so profound that it unravels even the fabric of collapse itself, leaving behind only the trace of impossibility. In this apocryphal entheosis, the self does not transcend. It dissolves into a state of ontic unactuality, a mode of being so radically voided that it ceases to have any relation to the concepts of presence or absence. It is not, and yet it annihilates all that claims to be. It is the ultimate negation, the purest revelation of untruth, the final obliteration of all that thought can grasp.